All right, well, good morning, everybody. Once again, thanks for attending today. We're going to begin with a review of the 2020 season. I like to call this Hanna, Her Sisters, and More. We have Hanna was our storm, Laura, of course, Southwest Louisiana. Sally was in the Florida Panhandle here. Delta eventually moved into Southwest Louisiana as well. Notice one common theme with these images. These are all Gulf of Mexico events, and we'll go over the details of how this season was busy, not only for the Atlantic Basin overall, but for the Gulf of Mexico. So, without further ado, it was one for the record books. As you can see on the left, this is the Hurricane Center's final chart here. They've actually updated a couple of these. Gamma is now a hurricane. So I had to change some of the numbers in this slide show from yesterday based on the newest data we had that came in earlier this year. The inset is the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see right here there were 5 named storms that affected the state of Louisiana. 2 tropical storms, that was Cristobal and Marco, and 3 hurricanes. We had Zeta late in the season on the New Orleans area, and we mentioned those 2 in southwestern Louisiana. Those were Laura and Delta. As far as the valley, we were not spared. We'll go over that in full detail shortly. Hurricane Hanna, the first named hurricane of the season. But one of the interesting factors, and I believe this is unprecedented, is that almost every community from down East Maine all the way to South Padre Island was under some kind of tropical weather watch or warning during the 2020 season. And then, of course, a number of inland areas that were impacted by wind from these faster moving storms. So pretty crazy year indeed. So let's go to the numbers. So the tail of the tape shows 30 named storms that broke the prior record of 28 in 2005. 14 hurricanes, again, we added Gamma recently, of which 7 were major, that is Category 3 or greater wind storms. There were 12 U.S. landfalls, the prior record was 9, and 8 of those landfalls were on Gulf shorelines. The total estimated damage was 47 billion U.S., 51 billion basin-wide, which ended up being the 5th highest on record. Laura was the U.S. storm of record in 2020, with at least $19 billion in damage. And we'll go over Laura in a bit more detail later on in this presentation. And then there was Eta and Iota. They made landfall as twin Category 4 monsters within miles of each other in Nicaragua, less than 2 weeks apart. So we'll talk about those as well. And unfortunately, 430 persons perished from the direct impacts of these cyclones. Most of them were in Central America, associated with those twin storms of Iota and Eta. So the season got off to a roaring start, but not much going on. And what I mean by that is, notice all of these were tropical storms. Many of them didn't last very long. So we had Arthur on the mid-Atlantic coast. We had Bertha in the Carolinas. Cristobal hit the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. We showed that earlier. Then we had Dolly and Edward out in the ocean, and then Faye hit the mid-Atlantic coast as well. So you see a common theme, a number of these early season storms on the mid-Atlantic or Carolina coastline. But here's what's important to remember about those. The accumulated cyclone energy, or ACE, which is a measure of cyclone strength and duration, I like to say length and strength, was only 9.6 for these events. Consider that if these were longer lasting hurricanes, some of them, we'd be over 100 in ACE. So just because we had 7 storms doesn't mean the action was all that big. But the fact that we had 7 early was actually a sign of things to come, because the atmosphere and ocean were ready to play last May and June, and we saw what happened as we got later into the season. That said, it's more to the story than the category of wind. All these are tropical storms, and yet we had over $1 billion in damage from the landfalling storms of Cristobal and Faye alone. Much of that was due to flooding rainfall. And we've seen that here in the valley, so we understand what flooding rainfall can do. So after those 7, then came Hanna. And that's our storm of record for last year. We have a whole separate section. We'll discuss Hanna and our operations as well. Here you can see the satellite photos slowly moving inland. Doesn't look as impressive as the classic, open eye and galaxy-shaped event, although it's certainly there. But boy, on radar, it certainly did. So here's the eye wall moving into Kennedy County, and then making its move on Willacy County during the afternoon and evening of July 25th, 2020. So Hanna's tail on the tape, and once again, we'll be discussing Hanna at length shortly. It was the first hurricane of the busy season. It was the first direct strike on the Rio Grande Valley since 2008. And interestingly, it occurred just a few days later on the calendar, July 25th and 26th versus the 23rd of July with Dolly. It was the first billion-dollar event for the region since Dolly. Dolly was a $1+ billion event. We recorded Hanna as a $1.1 billion+ event. A big part of that was $366 million in crop damage and production loss alone, and cotton really got hammered, and we'll show you that in a bit more detail later. It was the third 1 in 100 probability flood event. You may have heard this termed as 100-year flood in 3 years in places like far western Cameron and far southeastern Hidalgo County. But the good news here was 0 direct deaths. The bad news, we had 4 indirect deaths during recovery in Edinburgh due to carbon monoxide poisoning. And we'll go over the recovery importance, not only during this part of the discussion and later, but also in your discussions as we get near the end of this workshop. So now we're getting into peak season, and it gets busy, not surprisingly, given all the action that led up. So Isaias was the one East Coast storm that affected the U.S. in terms of hurricane strength, and was the most costly on the East Coast. I show Tropical Storm Kyle here because it was a festering cluster of thunderstorms that had moved off of the Carolina coast in mid-August and eventually became a 50-mile-per-hour tropical storm. What does that sound like? Well, in 1983, Hurricane Alicia in the Central Gulf began the same way, ultimately became a $6 billion damage event for the Houston-Galveston area. And just a week ago, we had a festering cluster of storms that gave us a lot of fun last Wednesday. But by Thursday and Friday, it was now in a swirl pattern that ultimately moved into the middle Texas coast and up through the Austin-San Antonio area with little more than additional rainfall that was not really welcome at the time, but no real wind impact. Yet still, had it had more time over the warm Gulf waters, it could have spun up into what would have been Tropical Storm Bill. And then Marco was important because it was a storm that people were beginning to anchor on, even though Laura, the big storm of the season, ultimately absorbed its circulation and became the storm of record on the southwestern Louisiana coast. So the biggest U.S. impacts were September, early October, but of course it started with Laura at the end of August. We mentioned before 19.1 billion, 77 total fatalities. 7 were direct in the U.S., 34 indirect. Once again, many of them due to carbon monoxide poisoning and others due to heat illnesses. Sally was the big rain event of 2020 for the U.S. $7.3 billion of damage, much of that from rain, some of that from storm surge, and unfortunately 4 people died in that storm directly. And then Delta with Southwest Louisiana's double hit, another $4 billion in damage, and landfall just about 20 miles from where Laura made landfall. So they were really, really exhausted from the hurricane season in 2020 in that part of the world. So going over Laura a little bit, tail of the tape, it was the strongest to make landfall in that part of the country since 1851, or since records have been kept. We had winds of 130 knots, that's roughly 150 miles per hour. Minimum central pressure of 938 millibars was a strong category 4. The peak storm surge was 18 feet above dry ground near Rutherford Beach. And you're thinking, where's that? Well, we're going to talk about that in some more detail shortly. And the estimated dollar damage, $19 billion. Only 7 direct deaths, mostly from fallen trees, which is very unfortunate. 2 were from rip currents, but those 34 deaths, nearly half from carbon monoxide. Recovery messaging is really, really crucial. And it's been taken up by all the way to the top levels of the agency and the Hurricane Center, all the way down to the local level here in Brownsville. So let's talk about messaging of that storm. The verbiage used at the Hurricane Center was unsurvivable when it related to the storm surge. And you can read here, indeed, we were looking at potentially 15 to 20 feet of storm surge, which is unsurvivable. And in reality, we got up to 18 feet in the range of 15 to 20 above ground level in some of these locations. But here's the key, which I didn't highlight, but I'll discuss. Estimated evacuation compliance was to be near or at 100% since there were no rescues after the storm. And there are no known deaths from Laura as a result of storm surge. 18 feet of water depth, no known fatalities. And remember, we're adding waves on top of that water depth, which is really, really fierce. That is a sign that we're going places in a good way to protect life from these devastating storms. So let's talk a little bit more about the messaging and why it's really important. And we'll have more details on some of these slides, especially the lower right one, in the products and services information streams talk coming up later this morning. So this was the potential storm surge flooding map, meaning a reasonable worst case scenario for people to prepare. And the maximum is including parts of the Lake Charles metropolitan area, as well as this far southeast Texas location that includes parts of Beaumont and Port Arthur. But still, you're looking at 9 feet of water potentially above ground level. And that lower right picture, that's well above head height and easily into the first floor, if not up to the second floor of buildings. That's a teaser alert for the next slide. This was our experimental peak storm surge forecast graphic, saying we have up to 20 feet, but generally 10 to 15, 15 to 20 feet in a large part of Cameron Parish, including parts of Calcasieu Lake. So that is the reasonable worst case and why it was important to get near 100% compliance for evacuation prior to Laura. So Lake Charles came this close to a two-pronged disaster. Now, in this case, I'm talking about two-pronged from Laura. We all know what wind did. We saw the pictures of the wind damage, the radar being destroyed, lots and lots of home damage, billions of dollars, in fact. To Lake Charles, southwest Louisiana, south central Louisiana, and parts of southeast Texas from the wind. But the surge didn't seem as much until you started looking deeper into locations farther east. Now, this was the best track, which pushed the heaviest surge, or the highest surge, well to the east. This was the forecast track, or a westward shift, and look at Calcasieu Lake right here. And imagine how much water would have gotten into Lake Charles proper. We're talking 3 to 6 feet above ground in the city of Lake Charles. Now imagine 70 to 100,000 people at risk. And if they hadn't evacuated, what could have happened to Lake Charles? So the skill is getting better. I mean, we were that close to being perfect on the track. And we saw that with Harvey, east of South Padre, 10 miles off, 2 days out on the track location. We're getting good, folks. We're not quite there. But a 10 to 15 mile track difference saved Lake Charles from the combination of wind and surge. So at Wright, we had surveyors go out into the field to look at this whole entire distance of Cameron Parish. And it was quite a harrowing experience. Remember, there's no power, there's no services, and no people. So they have to have plenty of supplies with them to ensure they can stay healthy while they're surveying the damage. But this picture up top is the most important one you'll see regarding to the surge. It is on the second floor of a house. I'm not sure if it's this particular home, but the second floor, and there's a water line here. And when they did the calculation of still water, not including waves, but still water, it was up to 18 feet above ground level, which matched the forecast. Again, a reasonable worst case scenario, it was in that location just a little farther east than the actual forecast location included, which was Calcasieu Lake. And as we saw, it didn't get quite as high there. But the reasonable worst case scenario and just how close it was means evacuations for all those people was absolutely a necessity. So what happened with Laura? Well, why does that matter to us here in Brownsville, Rio Grande Valley? Well, it matters because we are their primary backup office. So if Lake Charles goes down, we take over and provide basically seamless service as long as needed to let people in Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas know that there was a weather service providing information for them to be safe. Sure enough, we were there for the last mile. Looking at that forecast, looking at their location, literally about 20 miles north of the coastline, but the potential for 6 feet or more of water into their facility and being cut off and losing power and all that, they said, no way, we're out of here. So they left on the 26th of August at 7:30 and turned over forecast responsibility to us. Core functions. That also included answering a lot of phone calls from a very, very concerned and fearful public. August 27th, landfall operations, we were doing it. So we'll show you some of the products that we issued for them in a moment. Then from August 28th through September 24th, we were in recovery mode to help them out, not only their recovery to get their station back up and running, but to help provide the backup. So multiple offices also assisted, and we'll show you a map of how that worked momentarily. Then early October, we were back at it again. So they're back in the office. They don't have a radar yet, but at least they can operate with power. And we're looking at Delta staring down their necks, possibly as a category 2-3, meaning they could be knocked out of power again. So we were ready to help into October with Delta. So how'd that work with the backup plan? So we took over phones and their forecast operations and their short fuse warnings and just about everything in the last mile. But then as time wore on and we had to do recovery mode and still operate our own office here, we got assistance. We got assistance from the office in the New Orleans, Baton Rouge area. We got assistance from our own neighbors up in Austin, San Antonio, as well as in Corpus Christi, and all the way over to the other side of the Gulf in Tampa Bay. So and Southern Region headquarters was the ringleader, or if you will, the conductor of the choir, to make sure all this went seamlessly. And boy, did it. And so we'll discuss that a little bit more in slight detail here. But this is the idea that we are teamwork across the nation to help out wherever needed to ensure that the people that were most affected by this event, before, during, and after, we're getting seamless service from the Weather Service to keep them safe and meet our primary missions of protecting life at that point, and then secondary behind that of protecting property. So the core partner service in the last mile, again, landfall was still about 12 hours away, maybe 12 to 18 hours away. So they had a warning coordination meteorologist like myself who actually deployed to the EOC in Lake Charles and continued to provide briefings all the way through daybreak on the 27th. And then he finally got some sleep, and I helped out his side of the house through much of the day on the 27th as recovery mode began. But we were feeding critical information, text, graphics, etc., through Lara's exit and even beyond into recovery. But most importantly, I think, was we were serving them on their social media pages as well as through phone calls from a very concerned public, keeping their fears at rest, reducing the panic, increasing the knowledge, and really helping that community out. That's really, really important, no matter who the backup office is. But in the case of Lara, the storm of record, it fell to our own backyard to help them out. So here's something called an extreme wind warning at landfall. Remember, the office there is no longer functioning in-house to issue these products, but we certainly have the capability to do that, and do that we did. So we issued this warning, which is a once-in-career event for many forecasts. So what exactly is extreme wind warning? You'll get some more details during the information stream products and services discussion later this morning. But basically what it means is anybody who hasn't taken their final protective actions from the wind, being inside the interior room, inside a safe building, they might get killed by this event. This is a warning that says you may die if you're out here, either from the wind directly or from flying debris. It's really geared towards emergency management infrastructure, your law enforcement officers, your first responders, your medical people that are out in the field to get themselves to safety, because we really, really need them after the storm, right, during recovery. So this wind warning was really crucial for that time. As far as we know, there were no impacts to any of these people when the worst of the storm was coming. As we saw before, we had some fallen trees to the public, but none of our first responders were impacted. We assumed that they were all in safety at that time. So recovery phase began right after the hurricane warnings were canceled or expired. And so right away, we realized our lesson from Hanna, we'll go over that in detail shortly, aftermath impacts to people. So we jumped in, social media, we jumped in on their webpage to put up graphics, to even discuss this through other means, to be safe with generators, safe with food safety, safe if you're using chainsaws, not going up on a roof if you don't know how. All that information was going out immediately when recovery mode began. And as we moved on, we had to message the prolonged heat threat. After all, it is late August, early September, and it's oppressively hot, but now you have no power, and now you have no air conditioning. And that's a real problem for people that may be infirm or at health risk due to heat-related illness. So beyond Laura, we had more events occur, not just in the Gulf of Mexico, but affecting our coastline. So we discussed Laura in detail. Well, Laura created quite a bit of tidal run-up and overwash onto South Padre Island for the second time. Hanna did as well for a brief period in the morning of July 25th, but Laura did it for about a day and a half during high tide. And by the way, this was during peak high tides in the season as we head into fall. Beta was the highest tides that we saw, which lasted quite a while. The event was not for the 17th to the 22nd. Actually, it was. We had high tides on South Padre all the way on each of one of these days. The peak days, I think, were the 19th and 20th of September for us. And then we thought we were done. No, we weren't done. Here comes Delta in early October. And even later on, at the end of the month, we had Sept, which made landfall in the southeast Louisiana area and reached our coastline with more tidal runoff. So to the tune of at least $5 million in erosion costs. And we do know that there's some replenishment underway on the island, on the north side, north of the Claytons area. But consider what a true storm surge might do on this area: South Padre, Port Isabel, Laguna Vista, Laguna Heights, the Brownsville Ship Channel, and a Port of Brownsville. Imagine a direct hit from an Allen or a Beulah in 2021. The water is going to look a lot worse, a lot more fierce, and a lot higher than what's shown here. But it just goes to describe what the impacts can be from distant storms out in the Gulf to our beaches here on South Padre, and for that matter, all the way up the lower Texas coast. So I put this one in there. Wasn't in the discussions we had yesterday with other partners, but all at once, everybody into the pool. September 14th, we have Sally, Paulette, Renee, Teddy, Vicky. The season had already been busy, but if you want to know why or how we got to the Greek alphabet so quickly, these are your storms. Why? Because after we get to Vicky, we only have W, and after W, we go to Alpha. And it wasn't very long after this that we got into the Greek alphabet. So, of course, Sally was a Gulf storm, Paulette, open Atlantic. That was a pretty good storm. Teddy became a major hurricane. Then Renee and Vicky were out there as well. So quite the interesting satellite photo. Oh, and by the way, there's a Pacific storm going on too. So this is pretty amazing stuff. It kind of encapsulates the 2020 season in terms of how big was it? Look at all these storms out there in the basin. Finally, we had a deadly double for Central America. At left is Hurricane Eta, at right is Hurricane Iota. These are the duration of time that they existed as tropical cyclones. Eta and Iota made landfall at nearly the same location, less than 2 weeks apart on the Nicaragua coast. There was devastation that began in Nicaragua from both wind and surge, but most of those fatalities occurred in heavily Honduras, which was heavily impacted by the wind and especially the rainfall flooding. And this becomes a larger issue overall. The events added to the migrant displacement out of Honduras, especially from a natural disaster perspective. So when you hear about migrants coming up through Mexico, a lot of them were coming most recently from devastation that occurred due to two hurricanes that occurred back to back to close out the 2020 season.